My name is Leonardo Vivas. I'm the coordinator of the Latin American Initiative at the Harvard Kennedy School. And it's my great pleasure to welcome you to this conference. The conference is organized by the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School, the Nieman Foundation, and the support of the Rockefeller Center, who are, our hosts today. We will be working in 3 panels. We'll have our first presentation, then the panels will be discussing the different themes. And but I just wanted to welcome you on behalf of the Carr Center and on behalf of Charlie Clements, our executive director, who couldn't come today. He's on duty. He's traveling abroad. But I wanted to say that this idea about this conference began about a year or so ago, and it happened mostly due to a conversation that I had with my very good friend Pablo Corral, who's here, and we thought it would be a good idea to discuss the questions of freedom of the press in Latin America, given many of the setbacks that have been taking place in the region. And but we thought it shouldn't be just a normal defense of the rights, but also to have a critical view on what is taking place in the region, the question of responsibility of the media, and how that's worked in different countries. And of course, we started to talk to the Nieman Foundation, especially my good friend Stephanie Friedhoff, and this has been a very collaborative effort between the two. And our idea is that after 35, 36 years of democratization in the Latin American region, how can we measure the advances? It's freedom of the press is absolutely a critical part of that advance. And so we consider it kind of an acid test of resilience of democracy in Latin America, and both in terms of responsibility and in terms of what the questions of power and disputes with power. So I wanted to thank you again for coming. I'll give the podium to my good friend Stephanie, who will talk on behalf of the Nieman Foundation. And after that, we will have June Carolyn Erlick, who will be moderating the first panel, and it will be on her wise hands to take this on. So, Stefan.
Well, welcome everybody. Welcome to everybody on the live stream. Glad to have you. Sorry we're a little bit late. You couldn't be part of the conversations, but you'll be part of a great conversation here today. My name is Stephanie Friedhoff, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all here today on behalf of the Nieman Foundation for Journalism at Harvard. I welcome you to a day of witnessing and a day of listening to voices from places where silencing is the norm. When Leo asked us if we wanted to be if we wanted to come on board and co-sponsor this event, we did not have to think twice. The quality of journalism and a free press in Latin America are of deep concern to the Nieman Foundation. This is why we have a special Latin America fellowship, and we've had it for decades. Every year, we bring 2 journalists from the region to Harvard into a year of safety and academic opportunity. We're deeply indebted to the John S. and James L. Knight Foundation for their continued support of this program and our Latin American fellows. Now, if you take a look at today's schedule, you will see that it is densely sprinkled with current and former Nieman fellows. I can assure you this has nothing to do with nepotism. Most of the speakers at today's event were chosen before we even became involved. They're here today because they're committed to the best journalism has to offer: courage and ingenuity, fact-checking, independence and tenacity. They cover corruption, drug wars, power plays. They write stories about disappeared people, silenced communities, and violence against opposition. These journalists are here because they're committed to reporting what they find to be the reality in their countries and not the official version of it. And they're committed to this work in many ways we can't even imagine. At the Nieman Foundation, we also have a trauma journalism program, and I work with our Latin American fellows and journalists from other nations who have witnessed trauma and tragedy on things we call emotional literacy and self-care. We collaborate with the Dart Center for Journalism and Trauma, and Kate Black is here today, who's an associate director with the Dart Center. Our focus today is on what it takes to maintain a free press in Latin America, and not the impact this work has on the journalists who practice it. But I would like for us to keep in mind, as we go through the discussions of today, what it takes to irritate those in power. In a blog about his year at Harvard, Colombian journalist Holman Morris wrote, quote, "The benefits of being a Nieman Fellow are clear and straightforward. The happiness of my children when they get on a school bus instead into an armored car. The simple pleasure that my wife and I feel at being able to walk down the street without looking over our shoulders." In their pursuit of the truth, the journalists you'll hear from today have learned to live with intimidations, threats, and often worse. Silencing, as anyone who's ever experienced it will tell you, is the tool of terror. Speaking, on the other hand, delivering counter-narratives, documenting the impact of abuses of power, of corruption and violence on people and their lives, that is the tool of democratization, and journalists, well, they just like to use it. I said earlier that today we're all witnesses. Latin American journalists, not just the ones that can be here today, deserve our attention, validation, and support. I want to thank Leonardo and Pablo for bringing us together here. It's their idea, they made this happen, and we wouldn't be here without you. Thank you.
Good morning. Buenos dias. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. This is the beginning of this conference, which deals with freedom of the press. It's not an abstract thing. It's a matter of life and death. Ricardo Trotti, who is going to give us an overview of the situation in Latin America, knows that very well. He is the director of press freedom in the Press Institute and assistant executive director of the Inter-American Press Association. But more than that, if you've had the opportunity, there's a magazine outside on freedom of the press, ReVista, the Harvard Review of Latin America. And you may notice the very beautiful cover. Ricardo Trotti is also an artist. Why do I mention that? Because I think being an artist and being a courageous journalist and being someone who defends press freedom come from the same place, from a place of commitment, from the soul, from the willing to fight for what you believe in and to express it. But I think Ricardo can tell us much better. So I pass you over to Ricardo.
Thank you very much, June. And I believe the mic is not working, right?
I'll take care of it.
Okay. Thank you, Leonardo, Stephanie, and Bob for inviting me. It's really an honor to be with all of you, so thank you very much. There will always be abuses against press freedom and free speech. The administration of Hugo Chavez Rafael Correa and Daniel Ortega are now the ones that most frequently attack the press and democracy. These governments amend constitution at their leisure and control the judiciary and electoral processes, as it happened last week in Nicaragua. They shut down media outlets, such as Radio Caracas Televisión in Venezuela. They prosecute journalists like Emilio Palacio and the Perez brothers in Ecuador. They promote their agenda through propaganda on state-owned media and on populist rallies, while refusing to use or to hold press conferences. They ignore the Inter-American Court human rights rulings and expel human rights activists from their countries. But before was not different. These abuses were also common with Carlos Menem, Alberto Fujimori, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, and Collor de Mello. And I have not even mentioned how governments spy on journalists and members of the opposition. Serious cases were detected under Álvaro Uribe, Alan Garcia, and Néstor Kirchner governments. And the governments also engaged in smear campaigns against the press. We can mention Evo Morales, Ricardo Martinelli, and Álvaro Colón. Led by Hugo Chavez, the populist formula is to govern for the majority, with complete disdain for minorities and representative democracy. Without political opponents, these governments have made the press their main political enemy. Thank you. They also have taken advantages of the weaknesses of the media, such as low credibility, media concentration, sensationalism, and conflict of interest. For instance, in Argentina, my country, 2 newspapers and the government are shareholders in the same factory newsprint. Governments manage their attacks without breaching the law. They include clauses of media responsibility within their constitutions, such as the, quote, truthful information, unquote, included in the Venezuelan constitution that later on spread to other countries. The word truth only means the official version of the facts. It is in the name of the official truth that they enact press laws to control the media and to cover up corruption. For example, the communications bill discussed this week in Ecuador arose from President Correa. He needed to cover up the scandal caused by allegations that his brother Fabricio had gained multi-million-dollar contracts with the state. And if the law passes, it will incorporate mandatory licensing again, will demand media to have code of ethics, and it will censor content considered to promote violence. Néstor Kirchner, or the former Néstor Kirchner, enacted his media law in Argentina that gave him power and more control over broadcast media. And before that, Chavez enacted the media social responsibility law. At first, he said it was meant to protect minors from television content. But later on, he used it to shut down Radio Caracas Televisión and pressure Globovisión. And last December, the law was amended. Now, it criminalized critics on the internet and social media. In Brazil, it's not quite different. The official party proposed to enact similar laws, as well as President José Mujica from Uruguay, if media, he threatened, didn't stop publishing reports about violence. Correa also, in Ecuador, also refused to decriminalize defamation laws and eliminate insult laws. Without them, it would be more difficult for these governments to take journalists to court, such as members of El Universo newspaper, or like the authors of the book El Gran Hermano, the Big Brother, that mentions the scandal involving President Correa's older brother. The system also includes official campaigns to discredit the media. Correa dedicated seven national radio and TV broadcasts to rail against the authors of the Gran Hermano. And many others this week were delivered from him in reprisal to journalists who denounced abuses before the Inter-American Commission on Human Rights last week. And President Chavez used last Monday a national broadcast to block an electoral debate by 5 members of the opposition. The aim is easy, is to confront journalists and promote self-censorship. Correa is achieving that. According to Fundamedios, 70% of journalists in Ecuador practice self-censorship. There has never been such a big move to control media. Correa created an empire of 19 official news media outlets. In Nicaragua, the government owns more than a dozen radio and TV stations, and the same thing happens in Venezuela, Argentina, and Bolivia. TV programs by official journalists are used to discredit independent journalists. Also used is an army of cyber militants who attack members of the opposition and journalists on social media, blogs, and on the websites of traditional media. Drug trafficking and organized crime are also increasing. The situation has led to high levels of violence against the press and more self-censorship. Situation aggravated by the impunity and lack of action by governments to protect journalists. By the way, I believe you know, we are celebrating for the first time the International Day to End Impunity next November 23rd. The violence is not longer focused on Mexico. This year, 5 journalists had been killed in Mexico, but also 5 in Honduras, 5 in Brazil, 3 in Peru, and 1 each in El Salvador, Colombia, Guatemala, and the Dominican Republic. And the violence is not only affecting traditional media. In Mexico, 4 people were murdered in the past 2 months for their activities denouncing drug trafficking on blogs, Twitter, and Facebook. But well, within this bleak situation, there is also some progress, not many, and good trends. There are many governments committed to freedom of expression. Among them, those of Laura Chinchilla in Costa Rica, Dilma Rousseff in Brazil, and Fernando Lugo in Paraguay. Some of them, because they are journalists, even Nieman fellows, like Juan Manuel Santos in Colombia, promised to significantly increase broadband connection over the next 2 years. And Mauricio Funes, from El Salvador, another journalist, has recently made defamation no longer a criminal offense. Regarding the internet, other major changes should make us feel optimistic. Bloggers such as Joanny Sanchez in Cuba have found ways of unmasking the Cuban regime for its violations against the press. In Brazil, there is an extensive anti-corruption campaign motivated by citizens through social media. This online activity, supported by traditional media investigations, has made Rousseff, the President Rousseff, fired 5 ministers and enact the Access to Public Information Law. Some days ago, finally, in Mexico, the Congress passed a constitutional amendment to make crimes against journalists federal offenses. And in another development, as never before in the Americas, it's true that now we have a long list of organizations dedicated to press freedom. Well, that's all very well, but we, journalists, still face several challenges. According to a recent report by Freedom House, democracies in the region have weakened. Other reports, like the one from Latinobarómetro, says that the credibility of the press is decreasing. But at the same time, we can read what is going on the different electoral processes right now in Latin America and read the surveys that shows that the popularity of those presidents or governments who attack press freedom, like the ones that I mentioned, Chavez, Ortega, Kirchner, Cristina Kirchner, is increasing. Now, it's true that we have more laws on access to information and transparency, but corruption is not lessening at all. Journalists use these laws very little and fail to educate the people to use them. We demand more ethics of other professions, but it's also a fact that few in media are taking steps to improve working and professional conditions. Universities and the School of Communications have yet to contribute to the profession and the fight for press freedom. Worse yet, many journalists and media confront with governments, worsening the level of social polarization in each country, forgetting that journalism is to do journalism, investigate and shed light on problems. We inform more, we have more broadband access, but the question remains, as Leonardo said before, why are we journalists not connecting better with the people? Thank you.
Thank you. I met Mónica Almeida, when she came to Harvard as a Nieman Fellow in 2009. Precisely, I met her in a beer garden in Harvard Square with her daughter Sasha and her husband Mark. I know about Mónica that she's a great cook and that she's a wonderful dancer. So, in a minute I'll get to why I'm mentioning these things. She is the keto editor of El Universo, which is under a lot of attack right now, which she will tell us about. She's worked as a journalist for the last 24 years, both in Ecuador and in France. And she's given workshops on computer assistant reporting. And I also learned in the course of the year that she is a fantastic and tenacious reporter. So why do I mention that she's a great dancer and a good cook? Mm-hmm. Because when you hear her story of the pressure that El Universo is under, I want you to remember that every single panelist and many of the people here who are journalists, who are not panelists, have ordinary lives. And the threats are not only to them as individuals or as institutions, but to families and society. Mónica.
Thank you, John. I would like to start my presentation showing a short video of almost 4 minutes. That was a video that journalists prepared to present it at the Inter-American Commission of Human Rights. We were there on October 25th, and because we asked for a hearing to present their, what we consider were Korea's measures that put freedom of expression in danger. So I would like to show you that, and then I will tell you more about the case of El Universo.
Escúchenme bien, el presidente de la República no es solo jefe del poder ejecutivo, es jefe de todo el Estado ecuatoriano. Y el Estado ecuatoriano es poder ejecutivo, poder legislativo, poder judicial, poder electoral, poder de transparencia y control social, superintendencias, procuraduría, contraloría, todo eso el Estado ecuatoriano.
Que el presidente va a meter las manos en la corte, por supuesto que la vamos a meter, para mejorar esas cortes con las que nadie puede estar satisfecho. ¿Y qué tiene eso de extraño?
A esto le llaman despectivamente el insultadero de los sábados, ¿no? Yo no sé cuándo he dicho una palabra soez, procas. Ya no sean tan puercos. Y a esta porquería le damos la del zorro. Prensa como buitre, que esto me causa repulsión. Cavernaria, hipócritas. Prensa corrupta, groseros, cobardes, pasquín, jauría, prensa perversa, mentirosos, cínicos y antipatria. Estos pasquines, prensa conspirativa, son una porquería. Realmente dan asco. Perros hambrientos, cuánta basura. Sinvergüenzas. Por eso, cojan esta prensa corrupta. No sean engañados por estos sinvergüenzas.
¡Don José! Oye, ayúdame a abrir los puertos. Perseguidos políticos, son perseguidos políticos.
Libertad de expresión, libertad de expresión, libertad de expresión. Ya no es la lucha. Vamos a rechazar la prepotencia contra la provincia.
Los periodistas Juan Carlos Calderón y Cristian Zurita afrontan un proceso civil planteado en su contra por el presidente de la República. Los autores del libro El Gran Hermano son acusados de daño moral. En esa publicación se describen las supuestas irregularidades en la entrega de contratos en favor de Fabricio Correa, hermano del jefe de Estado.
Esta investigación sirvió para que el presidente de la República suspenda esos contratos.
Dicen que yo conocía los contratos. Bueno, vamos a usar el libro El Gran Hermano para que en la justicia demuestren lo cierto de sus aseveraciones.
Quien nos dijo eso fue el señor Fabricio Correa.
Rafael todo sabía. La demanda es por $10 millones.
Hace poco un editorialista de un periódico dijo que yo había ordenado disparar a discreción en un hospital lleno de civiles y sin previo aviso. Entonces, ¿qué es lo que van a decir los directivos de ese diario? Bueno, esa fue la opinión de ese editorialista. Mentira, ellos son responsables, es una opinión. Son infames, es una acusación gravísima. Nosotros estamos preparando una demanda no solo contra ese editorialista, sino contra los directivos del Universo. Va a marcar un hito en la historia ecuatoriana. Vamos a ver.
Escuchen.
Okay. As June was telling you, it's true that in my country, We don't have cases where a journalist has been killed or kidnapped, but we are now in a process where a government tried to silence the media. As you have seen in the video, there are, El Universo is not the only case. There are also two radio stations in the Amazonia. There are the case against the two journalists and the case against El Universo. And I would like to talk about this last case. It's the one that maybe I know the most, though I'm not a lawyer. But it started when Emilio Palacio wrote that article last February. And then it was announced that the president will sue El Universo because of criminal defamation. And as you heard, he thinks that the publishers that are also the owners of the newspaper, three brothers, are guilty because they should have vetoed the article. And that's the way he put it in his complaint. He also thinks that the company, he also sued the company, not only the owners of the company, but also the company, even though in Ecuador, under our legal system, a company can't not find guilty of a criminal, that's not possible. He did it, but his argument was that he did so for monetary purposes, for compensation purposes, and that's how it is written also in his complaint. And finally, he was asking $80 million because he added. He's saying that he's in charge of the general budget of the country. And if we add all that amount of money from 2007, when he arrived to the presidency, until 2011, it will be roughly $80 billion. So that's why he's asking $80 million in this suit case. Having said all this, the tricky thing is that he sued as a citizen and not as the president of Ecuador. So what has to do the general budget amount in this case, we don't know. And then in a normal situation, it will take like 2 years, more or less, to have a finding in this case. But this has been going very, very fast. This has been going with all changes in judges. And as you see, the 19th of July, they were already sentenced in the first instance, and there is also the particularity is that the judge in the first instance more or less repeated all the president's arguments. So they were found guilty. They had to go to jail for 3 years, and that's a slender when you committed against authority. So I remind you again, he is demanding as a citizen. But they are going to jail because the slender is against an authority. And then the newspaper and the 4 people had to pay $40 million. In the second instance, they only as an example, they changed judges like 10 times in 2 months. And within 10 days, they changed the date of the hearing 4 times. And the last time when we fixed it for September the 16th, the one who announced it was the president on Twitter. So it's it's a clear sign that is not an independent process. Why he wants to control the newspaper? That's what that people will ask themselves. It's because it's the biggest in the country. But we are not like a newspaper that also controls the telecommunication, the frequencies or something like that. We have the big newspaper, another popular newspaper, and a radio, a local radio. But we have a high readership, especially on Sundays. We arrive almost to 500,000 people. After Google and all this, the search engine in the web, we are the page that is the most visited in the country. We have more than 90,000 people on Twitter and Facebook. So this is really like, maybe being good now is being bad because somebody wants to silence you. And also what the newspaper is saying, because we are very news focused, very, very news. So it's also that in the radio, that is the media that has most the penetration in Latin America, in the radio, many of the radio just read our news. So it's a kind of, that's why we are target. And of course, we don't know what's going to happen. We are just waiting for the third instance. It can be tomorrow, as it can be within a year. We don't know. And but what I would like you to let you with this question is, if El Universo is gone, what will other media in Ecuador do? What will the rest of journalists do? And that's, I think that's a kind of a lesson that Korea wants to make. So if I got the biggest one, as a citizen, he will be in charge of the newspaper, but then what will the rest will do? And of course, it's a very sad answer.
Thank you, Mónica. Fernando Berguido, a friend, a great journalist, a wonderful editor, and a lawyer. A lot of journalists who have this courage and foresight that Fernando has shown during the past 7 years as publisher and director, editor, English, of La Prensa, Panama's leading daily, come out of two careers, being a lawyer, being a journalist, being an architect, being a journalist, because I think it gives this particular type of vision. During Fernando's tenure at the newspaper, the paper won more than a dozen prizes in investigative journalists. He's now a Nieman Fellow, and he will tell you his story. Thank you, Fernando.
Thank you, June, Leonardo, and friends. The 29th of August of 2005, the Attorney General Office of Panama informed that prosecutor Argentina Barrera had been suspended from her duties. An internal investigation found that she had ordered the alteration of evidence within a case instructed by her office. She was suspended because serious ethical faults were found, according to the official release. The following day, all dailies of Panama reported the news. La Prensa's headline took notice that it was the third case of a prosecutor investigated by Ana Matilde Gomez, an independent attorney starting her 10 years tenure as Attorney General of Panama. She had announced before her crusade against corruption and a cleanup at the Ministerio Público. La Prensa was careful to publish the suspended prosecutor's version of events next to the official communique. 5 years later, things has ended up upside down. Ricardo Martinelli, a wealthy center-right businessman, was elected president of Panama after winning on an anti-corruption campaign in 2009. He didn't like criticism of his government from day one, particularly from the opposition, civil society, or the press. Since coming to office, his government consistently has intimidated publicly and privately journalists, columnists, radio and TV hosts, media owners. Anonymous campaigns discrediting independent journalists has appeared on internet constantly. He acquired ownership of one editorial house responsible for publishing 3 of the 7 dailies in Panama after sending tax collectors to the previous owners, besides owning TV and radio station himself. His government regularly produces ad campaigns attacking news coverage, and he has tried, unsuccessfully so far, to enact legislation whereby the government will establish the salary of journalists and also seeking to regulate journalism itself through the old method of government issuing licenses to practice journalism in order to limit who could write or report the news. Similar to several leaders in Latin America, after winning as opposition candidate on clean elections, Martinelli has co-opted most of the entities designed by the Constitution to ensure check and balances, democratic principles in the government. He controls 5 out of the 9 members of the Supreme Court. The Comptroller General, a supposedly independent congressional appointee, became no other than his accountant, the accountant of his supermarket chain. He has played every trick on members of the political opposition. Cabinet members constantly attack union leaders and any member of the NGOs who dares to question his decision. Martinelli finally engineered the removal of Attorney General Ana Matilde Gomez halfway through her fixed-term appointment. After a new Attorney General was appointed by him and quickly confirmed by the official control Congress, Argentina Barrera returned to her old job. She and the other prosecutors removed by Gomez were clear of any wrongdoings. So, Argentina Barrera sued La Prensa for defamation and moral distress. She didn't sue the rest of the media that also cover her removal, only La Prensa. The case lingered groundless for a couple of years in the courts, but suddenly, last year, La Prensa was condemned to pay $350,000 in damages. I have used this case as a way to underline the advances and setbacks in freedom of the press in the past decade. By now, you have gathered that we are not in jail. 10 years ago, if found guilty, the journalist who wrote the story and I as editor, or Lourdes de Valdía, who is the present editor of La Prensa, would end up in prison. So the battle to decriminalize libel and defamation of public figures have won in Panama and in some other countries in Latin America. That's good news. Also, it's important for me to stress that a decade ago, there was not a single freedom of information law in the region. In the year 2000, when I was appointed president of the local chapter of Transparency International, knowing that Panama had no freedom of information law, I looked around for legislation to help us drafting one. Not a single country in the whole Latin America had such legislations. Since then, Panama, Mexico, Peru enacted formal and comprehensive laws in 2002, followed by Ecuador, Honduras, Nicaragua, Uruguay, Chile, and Guatemala. El Salvador and Colombia have pending legislation in Congress, while Brazil's Senate just approved 3 weeks ago the law. Also, the new digital social media is a very welcome player in the region. The bad news is that while murder of journalists in the region has not decreased, new sophisticated forms of attack on the press have surfaced. Civil courts, very much under the influence of political power, are granting awards against independent media as punishment, or as a way to bankrupting or silencing them, while sophisticated legal and financial maneuvers are taking place in order to gain control of capital structures of unfriendly media, if not buying media outlets right away, Berlusconi type. Mónica and Boris will comment on media attacks on their left-leaning leaders in their quest to silence anti-revolutionary imperialist media. But media attacks are not a monopoly of the left. Panama, as Colombia in a way in former President Uribe's term, is suffering similar threats from the right. Panama, as most of the region, is doing remarkably well economically. We have been growing steadily for the past decade, but we still carry the enormous burden of huge poverty and horrible inequalities, plus a weak democratic institutions. Presidential power is paramount, while an anemic judiciary is the norm. This is a poisonous mix for a free press to survive. In many countries, free, independent media is the only active and consistent barrier containing political power and investigating corruption. There is a new crop of leaders thirsty not only for power, but for wealth. When you study constitutional law, you learn that one of the legacies of Latin America to constitutional law was the mandatory alteration of power. In other words, the introduction of anti-reelection clauses in almost all constitutions in Latin America. It was a response to the accumulation of power by the caudillos in the 19th century. The end of the 20th century saw a reversal to that tradition. You may argue in favor or against re-election, but countries with weak institutions, overwhelming executive power, co-opted judicial systems with no real check and balances, where the rule of law is an abstract concept, for those countries, re-election of president is a real setback. And the concentration and perpetuation of power are quite effective fertilizers for corruption. Need evidence? With corruption rampant everywhere in Latin America, and maybe saving the case of Fujimori, you still have to see former presidents from Argentina to Mexico serving time in jail for personal enrichment or corruption. In my opinion, corruption has become the greatest enemy of emerging democracies in the region. A free press is virtually alone investigating into it and denouncing it. Courts, meant to be guarantors of a free press have become part of the system. Thank you.
Thank you, Fernando. Boris Muñoz. Boris is another one of those with a double life. He holds a doctorate. Triple, okay. He'll explain that one to you. He holds a doctorate in Hispanic American literature and culture from Rutgers. He's right now a fellow at the Carr Center for Human Rights Policy. Is that the triple?
Yep.
And he was a fellow at the David Rockefeller Center, and he was a 2010 Nieman Fellow. So he wears a lot of hats. So he's really a fellow. He's a good fellow.
I'm a family man. Good friend, too. Thanks, June. Thanks to the Rockefeller Center for hosting this event, and the Carr Center and the Nieman Foundation for inviting and giving me the opportunity to share some thoughts on the Venezuelan media war. My talk is entitled Media War in Venezuela and Its Outcomes. And I'm going to read the text. As we all know, for the last decade, the Venezuelan government and private media have been fighting a war whose battlefield is Venezuelan society. 10 years ago, when still a promising leader of a transformation process, President Hugo Chavez said, "In the class struggle, the private media are on the side of the oligarchy." In a conversation with journalist Ángel Azago, one of his advisors back then, he said that he would like to take up that fight. I don't want to portray private media solely as a victim. Every war has at least two sides. Chavez's extreme distrust of private media has some basis. Over the past decade, several private media have transformed most of their news and opinion programs into vicious slander machines. Of course, and it is not quite accurate to say that the confrontation between government and private media is new or exclusive to Chavez's administration. Private media and government became involved in a more or less open confrontation from the onset of the 80s, after a dramatic currency devaluation shattered Venezuela's dream of becoming a first world country. Private media organizations, particularly Radio Caracas Televisión, the oldest and largest national broadcasters, began to criticize the government and the democratic system relentlessly. The criticism became even more severe after the social uprising of February 1989 was brutally repressed by the army. When President Carlos Andrés Pérez was accused of corruption, RCTV and the newspaper El Nacional instigated a harsh campaign against the bipartisan political system and presidential power. This campaign had a great influence on public opinion and was a crucial factor in Perez's impeachment and removal from office in 1993. In other words, media organizations, deliberately or not, helped to undermine the system that sustained the Venezuela's experiment with democracy. One cannot fail to be struck by an element that clearly distinguishes Chavez's government from previous ones. As the quote I mentioned at the beginning demonstrates, the crucial difference is that Chavez actively sought battle with private media, and Chavez declared war not only on the media, but also on journalism as social institution. Between 1999 and 2003, there was a sustained increasing confrontation with the media. The most critical point in this war was the 12th of April of 2002, during the coup d'etat. That day, most of the larger private media, including the most important TV channels and newspapers, maintained a media blackout in order to keep the public misinformed. The only programs that they broadcast were cartoons. As we also know, the coup failed, and on April 13th, Chavez returned to the presidency. That moment marked a turning point in the narrative of the media war in Venezuela for three reasons. First, the blackout was a direct attack on democracy that badly hurt public trust in the private media. Second, it led the public to ask whose interests the country's main private media really serve. And third, the coup gave the government enough ammunition and arguments to discredit any serious attempt to recover private media's credibility. What were the consequences? The media war turned the most important private media into substitutes for the political parties they themselves had helped destroy. That is, they became the trenches of the opposition. This has led to the replacement of editorial principles by political agendas and economic interests, and of factual journalism by opinion-based journalism. Meanwhile, rigorous investigative journalism has deplorably been abandoned. In general, journalists as media workers have been trapped in the crossfire between the government and the economic and political interests of the owner of the media. At the same time, the media war was the point of departure for the creation of an impressive state media platform. According to Andrés Izarra, Minister of Communications, the aim of the platform were to erect a firewall against the attack of the private media and allow the government to transmit an official, and I would add, idealized imaginary of the revolutionary process. Our socialism needs a media hegemony, he said, and communications are a public service that must be run by the state. It is important to note that this media platform has gone far beyond the crisis that originated it and has become a structural component of Chavez's government. But this is only one aspect of the hegemonic control over communications that the government seeks to impose on Venezuelans. It has, in parallel, created a series of laws and legal instruments, such as the law of responsabilidad social in radio and televisión, mentioned by Ricardo, and other set of laws to protect its officials and servants from investigations or denunciations in the media. As we have seen in Ecuador, this is a model for export. The greatest proof of that this communication hegemony means political power was the closure or shutdown of RCTV in May 2007. In spite of national and international protests, this event had a relatively low political cost for the government. But for the opposition, the cost was too high. It severely limited the capacity to reach a national audience. This logic also threatens Globovisión, the news channel, which is the only remaining private TV station that is critical of the government. Once again, the face of the station is interlocked with the political and economic interests of its owners. Last June, Instituto Prensa en Sociedad and ReVista Semana in Colombia published some WikiLeaks cables that reveal how the government had put pressure on the banker Nelson Messerani, Globovisión's largest shareholder, to buy his partner's shares so that he could control the editorial line. Fortunately, it didn't happen, but the government has increased the siege of Globovisión by imposing a $2 million fine for instigating social unrest by reporting the largest jail mutiny a few months ago. It is not the first time that this type of sanction has been used to intimidate a media outlet. It happened in 2006 with the daily Tal Cual and Globovisión itself, when they had to raise money from the public in order to pay penalties, adding up millions of bolívares. In a country where the media are under attack and the autonomy of public institutions, such as the judicial system, is seriously damaged, journalists and media workers find themselves in an extremely difficult situation. They work in a climate of growing hostility and under increasing intimidation. All of this leads to my first conclusion. Winning important battles against the private media has allowed Chavez to organize political projects based on the control and manipulation of communications and public opinion. Here is a second conclusion. A central task of the new legal framework is to shield the government from public accountability and the need for transparency by depriving journalists of the possibility of doing rigorous and serious reporting and investigation. That is the ultimate goal of a media state under the rule of the autocrat. This brings up essential questions about the quality of our democracy. Under such systematic attacks on dissenting voice, can we still call democracy, Venezuela, a democracy? Yeah, I'm going to synthesize. Or it would be better to call it an electoral autocracy. On the other hand, having seen that the media war was partly created by the private media, we should ask what could be done to limit its disastrous impact on the free press and on democracy. That leads to a third conclusion. Media war is not only a political problem of two opposing actors, it's also an internal problem of private media organizations. So disarming the internal mechanism that contributed to the media war is a challenge that private media should take. Finally, the question of regulation. In my opinion, if the media are to survive the years to come, the answer is we need more regulation. Venezuelan private media should create an independent board to set, supervise, and enforce media standards. This board should be free from interference of media owners, politicians, and the government. I think that this would complement the demand for public information access laws. I know that this is not an original or new idea, but I would like to present it to you as a modest proposal for the debate on the Latin American media. Thanks.
Thank you very much.